activist. I've carried many signs, shouted into many bullhorns, but I didn't go to Ferguson in that capacity. I instead went to Ferguson as under the capacity of my profession. I'm a journalist, and I went there and I talked to people. One of the most interesting places to be was in Canfield, which was the neighborhood where Mike Brown was killed. Part of my work out there, I went and I tried to get a real feel of the neighborhood and what it was like. And it's one thing that, you know, working class people, we're taught not to talk about our own economic situation. We're generally taught, you know, it's not something you share. People were not totally, you know, willing to come forward with that, because we as the working class, we've been taught that's your personal business, you don't go there. But in Canfield, one of the primary jobs is home health care workers, people who work as home health care workers. That was one of the main jobs in the neighborhood, and that's about $10 or $11 an hour usually is what people make doing that job, and that's considered to be one of the best jobs that are there. There's a lot of unemployment, especially among the youth, and the big thing that people were pointing out constantly was, and it's been alluded to by the other people who spoke here tonight, was just how the police are just constantly breathing down on them. They said, you know, if there's a group of young men, young African-American men, one or two or more, and they walk out at night, the police are going to search them, they're going to pat them down, and they might choke them or punch them in the face just for the fun of it while they're there, while they're doing it. You know, we were in the neighborhood. We saw the vigil that was set up, the site with the flowers, and you know, one thing that really stands out in my mind, you know, there was a group of young kids from the neighborhood who were just kind of playing in the area, you know, running around as people were standing around there, and I know somebody from the Oprah network was there speaking that day, and so there was kind of a crowd, and this 4-year-old girl came up to me. And she said to me, you know, I was there with my camera crew and all of that, and she said kind of tauntingly, I know why you're here. And you're here because of that guy who I saw covered up on the sidewalk. You know? And that really stuck with me, to just hear that. But the thing that I kept hearing from people that I spoke to in the neighborhood that day that I was out in the neighborhood in Canfield where Mike Brown was ruthlessly murdered, was people kept saying that things here are getting worse. The economy is getting worse. It's harder to get a job. It's harder, and the police are getting worse. The police presence is escalating, and they kept saying it just keeps getting worse, and no one cares. That's what we kept hearing. Now, I got to talk about the first night that I was in Ferguson. We flew into St. Louis. It was already about sunset as we were there, and the sun was going down, and already at that point the police were closing up the streets. Roadblocks were being set up at all the major roadways, and so we had some contacts, friends of a friend who was able to direct us. We went to across from the police station there in Ferguson. There was kind of a 24-hour vigil that had been set up with people kind of standing around with signs and a tent. And then across the street there was a big SWAT team. And it was there that the movement was kind of giving people instructions about how to get in, how you could take back roads and get around the police barricades and get in to the neighborhood and get into the site, West Florissant and Ferguson Avenue, where the fighting and the protests had gone on. And so as we were going out through the back roads, we passed, every day we seemed to pass this one parking lot, this particular parking lot where the National Guard had set up. And we looked out there, and it was just hundreds and hundreds of these armored vehicles and tents, and it was like an army base had been set up in this parking lot. And I was actually forced to think of, there was a union activist and a folk singer, Joe Hill, and in one of his songs, he sang at the time one of the big weapons was the Gatling gun, which was an early machine gun, and he said, "Why do they mount up Gatling guns 1,000 miles from oceans, where foreign fleets could never land? Ain't that a funny notion? If you must know the reason why, just strike for better wages. And then, my son, if you don't die, you'll sing this song for ages." And it's interesting to think about, because they're always promoting military spending and building up the military budget, saying, we're doing this to protect you from those people over there. Well, we know what that military budget's really about. It's about fighting people who stand up to Wall Street. And when we stand up to Wall Street and we fight back here in the United States, they're going to use it against us. And that's the reality. That's the reality of the military budget and the military. When we got through the roadblocks, managed to maneuver our way, and we got to the crowd, we saw a crowd of about 2,000 young people in the streets. And you know, the media was full of these reports about outside agitators. I didn't see any outside agitators. I saw a crowd of young people between about the age of 18 and 30 from Ferguson, from St. Louis, marching. You know, that chant, "We're young, we're strong, we're marching all night long." It was a huge crowd, and I would say the crowd was majority women. Young black women were the majority in the crowd. It was women, and it was amazing, and it was very, very militant. I mean, the spirit was very, very militant, and you know, about 3 hours this crowd was circling the block, and every so often the police would kind of move in, and you got this feeling that the attitude of the police there was like, it was just this hateful attitude. It was like they saw the people in the neighborhood as worthless, and it was like, how dare they come out and protest. It was just this vicious attitude, and you know, every so often, you know, the crowd would keep marching around for about 3 hours, and then, you know, the police would come in with their riot gear and push them a little bit. And one particular incident stands out in my mind. There was a young man who had a sign that he had written on a piece of cardboard, and he was standing there kind of taunting the cops, and he shouted, "You all are cowards. You think you're tough, and you come out here when you got huge guns. We've got nothing, and you think you're heroes." And he shouted this at the cops, and he was taunting them. And then the police charged out into the crowd to go after him. So I was there in the capacity as the press, and as the police were charging out of the crowd, I said to the officer who was charging, I said, "So are you going out to arrest him because he called you a coward? Can I get an answer about that?" He didn't answer my question. You know, and that night things escalated, and it was kind of unclear what was going on. It was this crowd of about 2,000 people circling up, and it's a long block. It's not a small area. You know, it's a long block circling around and coming back, and so, you know, we're all circling, we're kind of following the crowd, and like I said, every 15 minutes or so, the police come in and try to push people out of the area. And then all of a sudden, everyone in the crowd is running that way. And we're all running that way. We don't know what's happening. We're running that way. And we're running that way, and all of a sudden we hear boom, boom, boom. And then we're all running the other way. What had happened, and what had happened, I guess one bottle had been thrown when we were all running that way. One single bottle had been thrown. And the response of the police was to pull out their shotguns and go into the crowd and start firing rubber bullets. And you know, that night in that press conference that Imani referenced, they denied having shot rubber bullets. But the next day at the demonstration, people brought the casings that proved that they shot rubber bullets. They shot rubber bullets, and the next night, I actually spoke to a young man who was struck in the face with a rubber bullet, had a huge gash on the side of his face. It was unbelievable. And, you know, back to when I was talking to people in the neighborhood, you know, people talked about, you know, some of the people in the neighborhood had done the calculations. They thought maybe it would cost about $6 million, but I've heard even bigger numbers. But they said, you know, all this money has been spent on bringing the armies and the police and the National Guard into this neighborhood. And they said, you know, if they wanted to make things better in Ferguson, why couldn't they provide one single job? Why couldn't they provide one single job? You know, and in the conversations I had with people, one point, you know, that was made, and one thing I just remember the most is that millions of dollars was spent to send all kinds of clergy and folks into the neighborhood to urge people to stop protesting. People from all over the country, people from the Oprah network, people from religious organizations, were all coming in, you know, to counsel people and urge them to stop protesting. But yet I interviewed people who kept saying, we had to do this. And the looting was a big issue. That was what everyone always brought up. They made it sound like all the protesting was this looting. But there was a young woman that I interviewed that I spoke to, and she said the looting was necessary. She said, because if we hadn't gone out there and looted, no one would know who Mike Brown was. She said, stuff like this happens all the time. All the time the police are beating people up, they're doing people, and it's happening. All the time they're doing this. And it's about time somebody did something. And if we hadn't gone out and wrecked some stores, no one would have cared, and they would have gotten away with this. That's a fair point to make. If I learned anything from being in Ferguson, what I learned was to never underestimate the masses. You know, you tell people that you're a communist or a socialist and you want a revolution, and they laugh. Oh, that'll never happen. Socialist revolution in the United States. Never underestimate the masses. You know, people fight back against oppression. And, you know, one of the things that struck me about it is that, you know, this was such a serious situation with people being killed and with people being injured every night. But the atmosphere of the people that were protesting was celebratory. It was like they were celebrating. Like this was their chance to finally fight back. And they were happy and they were elated as they were going out and protesting. And, you know, there was a T-shirt. I know one guy from the community, there's this picture that kind of went around the media of a young man throwing a tear gas canister back at the police. So there was a couple of people one night who had a T-shirt, and it had that picture on it, and below it said, "Ferguson fucks with the curfew." And it was like a pride, you know, like we went out and we fought. You know, it's a serious situation, someone's dead, but it's like people are holding their heads up. And I was forced, you know, to think of, you know, this is a book by Lenin. And in here, Lenin talks about a similar situation about 100 years ago. And he talks about how, you know, in Russia, the peasants and the workers were fighting back. And he says, this is the time for revolutionary parties to make their aims more comprehensive and more bold. And he's talking about, because some of the social democratic forces are saying, the masses are finally in motion. We can't bring revolutionary politics. Let's not ruin it now. And he's saying, no, this is the time to bring the revolutionary message. And this is what he said, and I'm going to end with this. He said, revolutions are locomotives of history. Revolutions are festivals of the oppressed and exploited. At no other time are the masses of people in a position to come forward so actively as creators of a new social order as at the time of revolution. At such times, the people are capable of performing miracles.